going to have to fight. We're going to have to struggle. We're going to have to struggle relentlessly.
Fred Hampton was the Panthers' most articulate Chicago leader. On the one hand, the Black Panther Party in Chicago was a free hot breakfast program for economically disadvantaged youth.
We're praying that Hanrahan leads the charge.
On the other hand, it was the arsenal which the Chicago Panthers collected and claimed it would use if its enemies came after them.
We could call them terrorists. Their avowed purpose was to kill police officers. Their motto was kill the pigs.
We don't care what anybody says, whether they have guns or not and badges or 18 uniforms. If whenever they step outside the bounds of legality into the bounds of illegality, then we'll blow their brains out if they're bothering the people. We know they have our pictures. We know they're looking for us. We know they want us.
And in the fall of 1969, Fred Hampton feared his enemies wanted to kill him.
He was talking about the police being after him and the FBI being after him, and in fact that was indeed true. As we learned later, I mean, within 2 months of his saying that to me, he'd been shot down in his bed.
Good afternoon. The 20-year-old chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, was shot and killed in a pre-dawn shootout with State's Attorney's Police in his West Side apartment. Another party member, 22-year-old Mark Clark of Peoria, also died in the shootout. Officers Edward Carmody and John Suzuki were not hurt seriously. They talked with NBC newsman Keith Klein.
Officer Carmody, when you knocked on the door, what happened?
Well, I didn't actually knock. I heard our officers at the front announce their office and shots fired. So I kicked in the back door, and as soon as the door opened, I could see shots being fired at us at the back door.
Did you have information that indicate that Fred Hampton might be there?
Not to my knowledge.
At this point, it appears that the people who are deceased were in the gun battle?
Oh, they were definitely in a gun battle.
I mean, they were firing at police?
Yes, sir. We saw the shots coming out of the two bedrooms.
Cook County State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan, a few hours later, presented the official account of the pre-dawn raid.
As soon as Sergeant Daniel Groth and officers James Davis, who were leading our men, announced their office, occupants of the apartment attacked them with shotgun fire. The officers immediately took cover. The occupants continued firing at our policemen from several rooms within the apartment. Thereafter, 3 times, Sergeant Groth ordered all his men to cease firing and told the occupants to come out with their hands up. Each time, one of the occupants replied, "Shoot it out," and continued firing at the police officers.
Some journalists took the Hanrahan account as the last word.
This is 2337 West Monroe, described by police as a depot for Black Panther Party arms and ammunition. 14 State's Attorney's policemen, led by Sergeant Daniel Groth, found out indeed it was a depot for weapons.
This is the NBC News Noon Report, the latest news with Jorie Lueloff.
But WMAQ-TV on its new newscast that day added a new dimension to the story. Producer Phil Walters invited 2 Black Panthers to Channel 5's Merchandise Mart studios to be interviewed live on the midday news. In the WMAQ-TV newsroom, there was great consternation about what the Panthers might say on camera.
So dead, you mother pigs, get off your dead asses, FBI and Jehu Edgar.
Panthers at public events typically used language not suitable for broadcast, but there was always an opportunity to edit the content. What might the Panthers say on live television when there was no possibility of deleting the objectionable?
Here is NBC newsman Fred Thomas with Black Panther Defense Minister Bob Rush and Minister of Information Chaka Walls.
Chaka, what do you think of what happened last night?
This is a clear indication by the fascists, murderous pigs that went into our Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton's apartment. These pigs were released by Daly and Hanrahan with an order to kill.
We'll prove that these pigs murdered Fred Hampton while he was asleep. They attempted to wipe out the Black Panther Party, and after if they succeed in this, if black people allow them to succeed in this, then they're going to move on black people in general, just like Hitler did in Germany.
So as early as 8 hours after the death of Fred Hampton, there were 2 contradictory accounts about what really happened during the course of the police raid. On the one hand, the Panthers and their supporters claimed that Fred Hampton was murdered. On the other hand, there was the account resolutely defended by State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan.
The account that we made public yesterday gives a detailed explanation of what happened in that apartment. I stand wholeheartedly behind it as absolutely accurate.
In an atmosphere supercharged by the competitive nature of Chicago journalists, a battle of headlines paralleled the conflicting accounts of the police raid.
I urge your inventory of each of these vicious weapons.
I have never denied that there was no weapons there. As a matter of fact, he would be a fool if he didn't have a weapon there.
A week after Hampton's death, State's Attorney Hanrahan gave the Tribune an exclusive. Photos purporting to show bullet holes left after the Panthers directed a barrage at the police.
Why was the disclosure made in the Chicago Tribune?
Because that newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, in my opinion, gave a very balanced, fair report of the events that occurred.
Henry has lied before, and he's going to lie again. That hole that he's blown up in the papers is a hole of a nail.
Tight close-up of a nail head.
Journalists who visited the scene concluded the holes were indeed made by nails rather than bullets. On its 10 p.m. newscast of December 11th, WBBM-TV broadcast a 29-minute recreation of the raid, which reflected the state's attorney's version. The police who participated in the December 4th raid reenacted it.
Like the Tribune exclusive that Hanrahan fed to the Tribune, this was fed to Channel 2, and Channel 2 just ignored any kind of journalistic integrity and let them produce it and let them put on what they wanted to put on.
At the time, there were so many allegations made that were unfounded by various persons, not only in the media but outside the media, that everyone felt that this was a proper thing to do or that we should do it to try to clear the air.
There were 3 shots fired from the rear bedroom, and I turned in his direction. I fired 2 shots at him.
Chicago's other television stations had been given the opportunity to film the reenactment, but only Channel 2 agreed to the condition that it be aired unedited and without interruption. WBBM-TV news director Bob Ferranti said, quote, "This first, clear, clinical, unemotional presentation is a community service. It is television journalism at its best." End of quote.
The second form, still coming up, caught a blast as the gun came further across the room.
The police, meanwhile, had never secured the scene of the raid.
They left the apartment open, and the Panthers seized upon that, and they had tours for like 2 weeks.
This is where our chairman had his brains blown out.
And people from the community went in by the hundreds and the thousands and went through and looked and saw what had really happened, saw the Swiss cheese machine gun walls, and they saw the bloody bed, and they saw all of the things that definitively showed graphically that this was a shoot-in, was an assassination of Fred Hampton. So all of that outcry led to the feds having to do an investigation.
The results of a special federal grand jury probe were released early in 1970. The grand jury did not recommend prosecution, though it supported the Panther version of the raid.
They had a ballistics expert who came down and analyzed all of these bullets, and he made the conclusion from a ballistic point of view that there were 99 shots fired by the police and perhaps 1 by the Panthers, and that was your shootout. But what happened was, as they got more and more into this investigation, they started to realize that the feds themselves were involved.
It was only in the early 1970s that the public learned that Panther member William O'Neill was actually an FBI informant, and that, among other things, he drew up on instructions from his handler a floor plan of the Panther apartment on West Monroe.
It was the document which then the FBI passed on to Hanrahan and his police so that they could know when to go, where Hampton would be, who would be there with him. So it was a very self-conscious document that was the linchpin of the assassination of Fred Hampton.
Do you think that the FBI used the state's attorney's office at all to further their own ends?
Looking back, there's no question. At the time, we didn't think of it that way. We received information from the FBI about some illegal activity. We obtained a search warrant, and the police officers went in and served the search warrant.
Is it possible that the FBI used local law enforcement to do some of their dirty work?
Well, I don't know if it was exactly dirty work, but let's just say that they probably didn't want to get involved in it, and they used local law enforcement. There's no question they did.
The new evidence about the raid did not lead to new prosecution.
Hanrahan had this ultimate hammer over the head of the feds, and that was he knew that the feds had set this up. So when they got around to saying, well, we should indict Hanrahan and his men federally, Hanrahan said, well, if you do that, then I'm just going to show that it was your ball game, not ours.
In 1983, following a lengthy civil suit, the city of Chicago, Cook County, and the federal government agreed to pay the survivors of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark a nearly $2 million settlement. But no one participating in the raid was convicted of a crime.
No one was ever convicted of murder. No one ever did any time, criminal time, which they certainly should have.
The political consequences can take care of themselves.
In his 1972 bid for re-election as state's attorney, Edward Hanrahan was defeated by Republican Bernard Carey.
I think that time will come when the people themselves will take the power that...
Panther Minister of Defense Bobby Rush became a Chicago alderman and then a United States congressman. One wonders what might have become of Fred Hampton had he lived.
You could see him as everything from a political leader, a community leader, a lawyer. I mean, he just was a tremendously talented and brilliant young man.
He said, but you have to remember one thing, and that's be strong. He wasn't afraid of anything.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Rich Samuels.